I wasn't intending to do another entry this morning, but after I'd been up a little while this morning, it occurred to me that I think Matthew set up this whole thing, a breadcrumb trail, with his pseudonym Dickens Jr. And the way I think he did this is that when he was there in Syracuse for a matter of a couple weeks or however long it was, I don't think he was that compatible with the editor. Maybe the editor was conservative, but anyway, he wrote this one story and then one other article about a local fellow, which I don't need to go into. So there's only a couple pieces in that newspaper that I found of his. But there's this one story, which is a particularly good one, which he signed Dickens Jr. And he realized that nobody in the future would ever come looking for it. They'd never associated with him unless he wrote a series under that pseudonym for the Oddfellow, because he knew that he wrote under the asterisk, the star for the Oddfellow, that he would probably get traced that far, being that he was a member of that group, just as, in fact, I did trace him, but that he would never get traced to the Onondaga Standard in Syracuse unless he left this breadcrumb trail of a whole series, pencilings and whatever you call it, pickings and pencilings, signed Dickens Jr., so that then somebody might find the same one in the Onondaga Standard. Now, that could be far-fetched. It's possible it was just a coincidence that he was up there and he wrote this one story as Dickens Jr. and he liked the pseudonym, so he wrote another series for the Oddfellow back home in Boston. But I think there's more to it than that, and the reason I feel that way is that the story is really good, and it's just exactly as Matthew would have thought of Dickens. In other words, if he was going to write something in tribute to Dickens, it would be something like this. As I said yesterday, that's not really who Dickens was, but at this point, that's what Matthew believed. He projected himself basically onto Dickens and took him as the real thing, whereas Matthew was actually the real thing. I went into all that yesterday. But it's this story in particular that really shows forth what Matthew can do in this genre of storytelling. And the other ones are just kind of, they're in support of the Oddfellows organization, obviously. You know, even the last one was not really a story. It was kind of, I don't know if it was a real account or a fictional account of a little girl who died who was very spiritual. I think it was a fictional account that was very loosely based on Abby as a child prodigy and a spiritual child prodigy. But this story is something else entirely. So I would say that what I need to do is to read this whole story. So it's story time, boys and girls. I'm going to read this entire story of Everard and Fidelia. I'm going to try not to interrupt too much. So I'm going to give my commentary at the beginning here and then just launch into it. It's somewhat lengthy. You can listen or not listen, but we'll have it on tape, as it were. This is basically on the theme of being misjudged, misunderstood, of being a virtuous person who is falsely accused, and then about the few people around one that still have faith in one, even though everybody else has lost faith in you. And this was a theme that both Matthew and Abby lived through. Both of them were ahead of their time, as the psychic mediums that I used early on in my study told me, without knowing anything about them. They were very much ahead of their time. They were both child prodigies. They were both spiritual persons. They both were deeply versed in the perennial philosophy, if you want to call it that, the mysteries. They were wrongly judged and shunned. And I basically go through this today. I've been back on the university websites looking for professors in philosophy, religious studies, and psychology that I could write to present my paper about my own studies, as opposed to something about Dickens and Poe or things like that. And I can't find anybody. maybe out of 2 or 3 universities, I'll find one person that's even a plausible candidate. I did this for my documentary back in 2006 or 2007, and I noted then how deeply materialistic psychology, for example, had gotten even since I got my degree in 1981. Well, it's even worse now in 2021. Basically, it's all brains. It's all neurology. As a matter of fact, the title of the thing is usually neurology. Their, their, their specialty area has to have the word neurology in it somewhere, There might be one behaviorist. Well, back in my day, the behaviorist was the materialistic guy, see? And now they're basically, the behaviorist is the one lone maverick that doesn't want to talk about brains. So it's just awful. And religion is the history of religion and the rituals and the rites and the ceremonies and the scriptures and the sociology of religion, basically, for the most part, unless they're true believers in traditional Christianity. And philosophy is, well, my guru said it best. He said that philosophy is a simple thing made difficult. I have nothing to add to my own guru, Meher Baba's comments on that. So this is a theme that's dear to Matthew and Abby's heart. It's written December of 1846. This is probably 5 years after The Raven was written. So I'm going to continue with this. And again, I'm going to try not to stop very often. I might make a comment here and there, but I'm going to try to just read it through so you'll get the impact of the story for those 2 or 3 contemporary people who actually listen to it, and however many in the future. Written for the Standard, which means it's original, Everard and Fidelia, or The Force of Circumstances by Dickens, Jr. Chapter 1. Everard Ledyard was the only son of a wealthy London merchant, and was reared in the trade of his father, who always found him exact in his business and punctual in attending to it. He was a person of beautiful, intelligent face, a fine, manly form, with eyes that sparkled with wit and animation. For one thing, Everard was noted from boyhood. He would never suffer the weak and unprotected to receive insult or injury without attempting to defend them. He was considered a kind of Moses among the Egyptians in this respect, among his associates. This trait in his character followed him to manhood, and came near costing him his life on many occasions, and especially on that which is the foundation of the following story. Everard had been busily at work in his father's store, adjusting the accounts of the house one day, until near the close of business hours, when he heard a cry of distress. Hastily leaving the counting room, he ran to the place from whence the cry came, arriving there just in time to see one man raise a dirk to plunge into the breast of another, whom he held by the collar. Without waiting for any words, Everard sprang forward to arrest the weapon, but too late. It had sank into the breast of the victim, who fell upon the ground when the murderer fled precipitately. Kneeling by the side of the wounded man, Everard attempted to draw the dirk at the instant the police arrived, and the dying man exclaimed, "Oh, you have murdered me," and expired. So shocked was Everard at the event that he did not recognize the man who had committed the act, but declared his innocence, stating the circumstance which had brought him there. His assertions were not believed. He was known to have had some words with the deceased a few days previously, and the circumstances were all very strong against him, and he was committed. On the trial, the testimony appeared conclusive. The real murderer was one of the witnesses. The dirk was presented, and the garments stained with blood worn by Everard on the fatal occasion. He was condemned. The event fell with crushing weight upon the father and mother of Everard. His mother listened to his protestations of innocence and believed them. Not so his father. He believed his son guilty, and with an afflicted heart gave him up to die. Keen was the blow, however, upon that father's heart, to see his only son, an only child, branded as a murderer. One there was in that great city beside the mother of Everard, who had heard the statement he made and believed it. This was Fidelia Lansing, with whom Everard was under arrangements of marriage. She was the daughter of another merchant, a lovely girl of 18. She had grown up with Everard from childhood. Her heart was undividedly his. No one, she thought, knew him better, none loved him more, and from the moment she heard his sentence, she resolved to save him if possible, or to die with him. To carry out her resolution, she obtained permission from her father to spend a few weeks in the country among her friends. Instead of going there, however, she ordered her carriage driven to a dressmaker's, where she caused a plain suit of servant's apparel to be made. When finished, she attired herself in it and proceeded to the prison, where she applied for a situation as servant in the family of the keeper of the prison. Pleased with her appearance, the keeper's lady employed her as an assistant in her room. After having been a day or two employed in her new situation, Fidelia expressed a desire to visit the various apartments of the prison, having never done so. Her request was granted, and the lady accompanied her. On approaching the cell in which was confined the object of her love, she carefully took from her pocket a white handkerchief, in which were folded up a file and a purse of 200 pounds with the following note: "Dear Everard, be of good cheer. Thy Fidelia has proved thy innocence, and has come to release thee. I am employed as a servant in the family of the keeper of the prison. With the files, remove your chains. I will open your prison doors, and with the gold I give you, fly to New York under the name of Norman Francis. Write me when safe, and I will fly to you. Thine forever, Fidelia." Not suspecting her, the lady who accompanied Fidelia did not notice her as they approached the cell of the reputed murderer, or she would have discerned in her agitation and paleness reasons for caution which was not observed. Carefully throwing the handkerchief into the cell as the lady's face was turned in another direction, Fidelia walked hastily away, remarking, "Let us leave this dreary place. I am quite overcome with the sight, to me so new and painful." Chapter 2. Everard was standing with his face toward the window of his cell opposite Fidelia, so that he did not see her face as she stood at the door, and did not hear her as she left the hall. Soon after her departure, on turning round, he discovered the roll and took it up, opening it with surprise. But greater still was his surprise and joy when he read the note in the familiar hand of Fidelia, whom he had given up with all others forever. "Heroic, angelic woman," said Everard, pressing the letter to his lips, "for thee will I still live, and do I desire to be free. But for thee I had sought death as a liberation from unjust ignominy and disgrace. Yes, I am innocent, and to know that my innocence is believed by thee shall arm me with fortitude and courage, which but for thee I could not command. Thanks, generous Fidelia, thanks for thy heroism, and yet I fear that for me thou art periling thyself. Rather would I meet death, even the death before me, than see thee suffer." Everard involuntarily shuddered as these words fell from his lips, and arose as if he would call after the being who had visited him. But the heavy chains upon his limbs admonished him he had still a great exertion to make before, as on other days, he could be free, and with a joyful heart breathe words of love into the ear of the angel of his heart. Being thus called to the painful reality of his situation, Everard again seated himself upon his cot to meditate upon the plan for his escape which Fidelia had adopted. As he cast his eyes around and beheld the huge dark walls that environed him, and saw the heavy iron doors with its strong bolts, and remembered that 2 of these must be noiselessly opened, his heart failed almost. Should he fail, it would be fatal to him, and should Fidelia be discovered, she would be ruined. But then again, he thought, my cause is just. God knows I am innocent. My offense was an act of the highest benevolence. My accuser is the guilty one. Yes, God will succeed my exertions. When all was still again in the prison, Everard awoke from a troublesome sleep. He had dreamed of being drawn up upon the scaffold. Thousands were gathered there to witness his ignominious death. His adored Fidelia was there in tears, and his mother frantic with grief. There, too, his stern father with an unforgiving brow, and the real murderer calm and unmoved at the dread scene. He awoke and found himself drenched with a cold, clammy sweat and weak from excitement. But the joy of knowing it was yet a dream soon restored his strength, and he commenced filing off his chains. 1 hour had he only worked when one strong link was reduced to the film of a wire. This he allowed to remain, that no suspicion should be excited in the mind of his keepers, and carefully concealing his gold, the file and handkerchief, he threw himself once more upon his couch to rest. Again Everard dreamed, but not as before. Now he was rejoicing by the side of his own sweet deliverer upon the heaving bosom of the Atlantic. The bright sun was casting his dazzling rays upon the foaming ocean, and the ship proudly moved with puffed sails to the land of the free. When he awoke, the sun had just arisen, and threw his gleaming smiles through the grates to bid him be of good cheer. Hope nerved him. He arose and sat down to reflect upon the future. Chapter 3. We will now, for a few moments, visit the lonely mother of Everard in company with Fidelia. The day following that on which Fidelia had visited the prisoner, she also called on the mother, to whom she made known her plans and proceedings, and obtained from her a promise of the most profound secrecy, and made provisions for an additional sum of £200 for Everard. Long did they commune together with reference to the bold movement. Once Fidelia proposed to visit the cell and to exchange garments with Everard. This proposition, however, was rejected by her mother as altogether improper, and besides, said Mrs. Ledyard, Everard would never consent to such a proposition. After the foregoing interview, Fidelia returned and set herself at work to secure the keys when the time should arrive to require them. Having learned the place of their deposition, she then ascertained the hour when all communication with the prisoner ceased. This done, her object was half gained. Her next movement was to learn when a ship would sail for New York. By the papers, she learned that in 2 days the merchant ship Commerce would depart. The next day she again visited Everard's mother and gave directions to have his clothes, mask, and money in readiness. It was also arranged that he should meet his mother in her room at midnight to take his final farewell of her previous to his departure. The name to be assumed by Everard was the same of Mrs. Ledyard's brother, who was daily expected from the country to leave New York in the first boat or ship that should depart after his arrival. The mask assumed by him was such as nearest resembled that gentleman. This precaution was adopted to prevent discovery from the father of Everard in case he should be near at the visit of the young man to his mother. For although Mr. Ledyard loved his son, he was so fully convinced of his guilt that he utterly refused to do anything for his escape. Moreover, the high standing of the real murderer, his oath against Everard, and all the circumstances of the case rendered all suspicions silent. After her return, and all things prepared according to her wishes, Fidelia found an opportunity to pass unnoticed to the cell of Everard. It was the first time she had spoken to him during his imprisonment. After informing him of what she had done, she left him a written direction of the course he was to pursue. The time for his release was to be the next morning. Everard was deeply afflicted at the thought of leaving Fidelia and his friends. "Would you accompany me, dearest Fidelia?" said Everard. "I could dare anything, but to think of going alone and leave all I love behind and perhaps never to return, oh, the thought is almost equal to death." Up to that moment, Fidelia had not dreamed of accompanying him, but upon witnessing the deep affliction of her betrothed, upon hearing the words, "perhaps forever," she resolved to go unprepared as she was. "I will go, dearest Everard," said she, "but I must first go secretly home and procure some articles." Saying this, she noiselessly retired, returned in time to make other preparation for her perilous enterprise. During the night, Everard succeeded in removing his chains, and then threw himself upon his cot to sleep with a trembling heart, hoping to succeed, yet fearing detection and defeat with death. On arising in the morning, he fastened his manacles to his limbs to prevent the discovery of their having been filed, and received from the keeper his fare as usual. But at 9 o'clock, when the keeper entered his cell and bade him arise, the heart of Everard almost sank within him. "Surely," said he, "I am now lost." "Perhaps not," replied the jailer. "If you are innocent, some circumstance may yet show it." This remark greatly relieved the mind of Everard, showing as it did the jailer was not suspicious of anything. His great anxiety now was for the return of night, when his fate was to be sealed. The night came, and with it many anxious, trembling moments to the three who were acquainted with the movements of Fidelia. Chapter 4. "Are you ill?" inquired Mr. Ledyard of his wife. "Are you giving your feelings too much liberty with regard to your too much indulged and now ruined boy?" "I think of you, dear son, to be sure," replied Mrs. Ledyard, "and trust the time will yet come when you will know, as I do, that he is innocent, and that, in all probability, his accuser is the real murderer of the man who Everard is now condemned for killing, and whom Everard tried to save. I fear your sympathy has more to do with the matter than your good sense," he said, adding, "You had better retire, and obtain by rest and sleep that relief I am sure you need." "My brother may be in town this evening, and I think I will wait the arrival of his post, which is 1 o'clock, said Mrs. Ledyard. Not thinking strange of it, Mr. Ledyard retired, leaving his wife to remain. While this conversation was passing between them, Fidelia had silently entered the room where the keys were kept, opened the doors of his cell, and without alarming anyone was on her way with Everard to his father's house, to receive his mother's embraces and then to depart, perhaps forever, from his native land. The first warm greeting over, Mrs. Ledyard procured the mask and dress furnished by Fidelia, and he remained with his mother until near morning, when he left, and with the name of Norman Francis with Fidelia proceeded to the ship that was to bear them from the scenes of peril. Before leaving, Fidelia addressed a letter to her parents informing them of her departure, giving a full and glowing account of all that had transpired in relation to the escape, and asking their blessings. She felt assured of their forgiveness from the high regard entertained for Everard and the cheerfulness with which their consent had been given for the union, and she believed she had fully satisfied them of his innocence in the letter written them. Nor was she mistaken. Grieved as they were at her leaving them, they could not feel angry at her course, and rather rejoiced at the success of her romantic and heroic adventure than censured her. They did not doubt that the energy and perseverance which had given success to her plans would be adequate to the duties of future life. In closing her letter, she gave them direction for future correspondence, and desired as soon as possible, after hearing from them in the U States, that they might remit such sums as they might feel disposed to do to the address of Norman Francis. And there's asterisks, which mean either it means something's been omitted here, or it means there's a gap of time, or change of scene, possibly. We now return to the prison. At the usual hour, 8 o'clock of the morning following the escape of Everard, the servant, as usual, accompanied the keeper in his room with his morning ration, and called him to receive it. No answer came. Again he called, but was only answered by the echo of his own voice. The door was opened. The prisoner had fled. Casting his eye upon the couch, the keeper saw a letter addressed to himself, written with the point of his file upon a portion of the sheet sent him by Fidelia. It read as follows: Dear Sir, I regret to cause you, who never injured me, any trouble. I would not do so were I guilty of the crime with which I am charged. But being innocent, the first law of nature justifies my escape. My principal accuser is the man who took the life of him I tried to save. When you read this, I shall be beyond your reach. The person who opened the doors has done no more than you would have done under the same circumstances. Her name cannot be ascertained. Everard Ledyard. The keeper of the prison immediately posted notice in every part of the city, offering large rewards for the apprehension of the prisoner or the discovery of his accessory, but without avail. The winds of heaven favored his flight and wafted him rapidly away from danger. Before leaving the paternal roof, Everard addressed an affectionate letter to his father, giving the circumstances that occurred at the time of his arrest, and repeated with the most solemn protestations his innocence, accusing the real murderer of the crime of which himself had been charged, and asking him to suspend his judgment until time should reveal all to his satisfaction. Had Mr. Ledyard seen his son at the moment of receiving this letter, he would have revoked his harsh decree of disinheritance, but in his absence rumor gained credence, and from his having broken from prison, many adjudged him guilty. Chapter 5. The winds and the waves appeared to be in alliance with the fugitives, and in a few weeks the proud ship anchored in the harbor of New York, where, immediately upon landing, Everard and Fidelia were married, and in a few days, through the assistance of the captain, who had become highly pleased with Ledyard, alias Francis, he was employed at a good salary in a respectable wholesale establishment in the city. This was Matthew's own employment when he pursued a mercantile career, so he's drawing on his own life here. It required but a short time for Everard to render himself a favorite in the establishment, and he soon enjoyed the esteem of his employers and associates in a high degree. And but for the false imputations resting upon his fair fame at home, and the absence of those dear to him, he was happy. Indeed, he was so, as it was. Fidelia was ever cheerful and happy, and sought as much as possible to remove all recollections of the past from his mind. In the letters received from his mother and from the parents of his wife, Everard received the kindest assurances of regard, and they were so far rendered quiet with regard to affairs in their native city. After Everard had been in the city 2 years, he received a proposition to become a partner in the house in which he was employed. And this is going to be autobiographical to a pretty strong extent, actually. To this he assented and was enabled, with what he had received from London, to invest $5,000. Thus, everything seemed to promise prosperity and success. Business was good, and wealth seemed to pour her golden treasures with a lavish hand upon him. But the tide of human prosperity is often fluctuating and treacherous. His partners were not content with making money by hundreds daily from the slow process of trade, and proposed to subtract a few thousands from their legitimate business for speculation in Western cities. This same plot shows up in The Perils of Pearl Street, which Matthew wrote in, I think it was 1834, which is mistakenly attributed to his former editor, Asa Green. A township was offered them with railroads, mill sites, and villages. Crowds of emigrants would pour into it from the East and from the Old World, and every dollar would yield them 40-fold in a few years. The purchase was made. $100,000 was paid for a township. In less than 6 months, they ascertained the whole was comparatively thrown away. Then came losses in trade, and within a year from the first digression, the firm was bankrupt. One of the partners absconded with the funds on hand, and the rest were left destitute and involved. Aided by the fortitude of his estimable wife, Everard met these reverses with firmness, and being unable to obtain speedy remittances from London, and having no employment, he was compelled to dispose of his furniture and retire to a small tenement in a remote part of the city. Here, with stinted means, he lived, in the daily hope of assistance from his friends. Week after week passed, and no news reached Everard from London, although himself and Fidelia had written to their friends. Every day was reducing his small means, and no employment had been obtained. Still, to add to their sufferings, sickness, that destroyer of human energy and courage, laid its crushing hand upon them. Everard was confined to his room for several weeks. Like a ministering angel, Fidelia watched by his couch without a murmur, soothing and encouraging him to hope on. Driven at length to the necessity, he parted with the last treasure, a gold miniature case, presented by his mother on leaving his native city. With the avails of this, his means of subsistence were lengthened out for a few days, during which time his health was so far recovered as again to justify the attempt to gain a situation as a clerk. Several houses were applied to, but without success. Indeed, he had become so reduced in strength and spirits that few, save from mere charity, would have employed him. To ask it on that ground was too humiliating, but he did not shrink from even that when all other exertions failed. But even this did not succeed. Such is often the sympathy of man. In his prosperity, Everard had many friends and admirers. In his adversity, when friends were most needed, he was not known. A situation was at length obtained which afforded him $3 or $4 per week. In this situation he had been engaged a month when he was again prostrated by sickness and reduced to great destitution. In this extremity a laborer who had once enjoyed affluence found him and generously administered to his necessities. With this expression of kindness his heart was encouraged and hope once more faintly revived. Chapter 6. The last dollar was in the hands of Fidelia. She started out to obtain something in the shape of light food for her husband. The first place she called at was the store in which her husband had been employed a few days previously to his present sickness. At this place she obtained a few pounds of rice, which was done up in a copy of a New York paper of recent date. On returning home, the contents of the paper were removed, and it was thrown upon the table near to Everard. Taking it up, he carelessly ran it over when his eye caught the list of passengers that arrived 4 days previously. Among them he read the name of Mrs. Ledyard and her servant from London. "Can it be possible?" said he, dropping the paper. "Can what be possible?" said Fidelia, alarmed at the paleness of her husband. "I notice here the arrival 4 days since of Mrs. Ledyard and servant. Can it be my mother? It would hardly be possible that she should remain here 4 days and not find you." "Not at all impossible that, since we have occupied so retired a place. I will go immediately to the hotel and see if it be indeed herself," said Fidelia. "And what will you do, my dear, if it is her?" inquired Everard. "Do? Why, invite her home with me, to be sure," answered Fidelia. "So I suppose, but of all my sufferings I could endure anything almost better than that of inviting her to be a witness of our poverty and distress. You do not know the heart of your mother yet, if you imagine that in her joy to see you, she could overlook all the circumstances around. Then you would have time after that for explanations. By heaven, Fidelia, you must not go to the Hotel on foot. You are not able." "Indeed I am able, were the distance twice as great. Beside, the hope of seeing her will add greatly to my strength and courage." In half an hour from the time this conversation occurred, Fidelia stood at the office of Hotel. "Have you a lady here of the name of Ledyard?" inquired she of the clerk. Turning to his books, he soon replied, "We have, madam. She occupies 41 on the first floor. A widow lady, I believe." "A widow," said Fidelia as she turned to go up. "I say, madam," said the clerk, "were you not from London, and is not your name Fidelia?" "Yes," replied the woman. "Well," added the clerk, "you recollect the boy who once stole your purse and ran away from your father?" "Yes, Dick Frost. Are you that person?" "I am, and here is your purse, amounting now to $300. I have seen you pass several times and inquired for you often, but could not ascertain your location. Do you forgive the offense?" "Certainly. Good morning." It's kind of an interesting contrast to some of Dickens' characters. Fidelia was soon at the door of the room. On the door being opened, she saw with the greatest joy the mother of her beloved Everard standing before her. Uttering a shriek, she threw herself into the arms of the lady, and crying, "Mother," wept upon her neck, unable to speak. So unexpected was the appearance of Fidelia, so changed withal, that Mrs. Ledyard did not at first recognize her. A moment, however, explained all, and Mrs. L. and her daughter were in a carriage on their way to the humble abode of Everard, where a meeting of deeper interest followed. The cause of her visit was explained as soon as her feelings would permit, from which it appeared none of her many letters to Everard had been received. Someone had intercepted them. A few months previous to her leaving London, a note was sent to Mr. Ledyard desiring him immediately to call upon M.S., who was dying. He did so. The dying man drew him to his bedside, where he confessed himself the murderer of the man on whose account Everard had been convicted. The disclosure was received with surprise by all, but upon none was the effect so great as upon Mr. Ledyard. The conviction of his son's innocence, the injustice he had done in condemning him, the banishment and suffering he had endured, overcame the father, and he wept aloud. Hastening to his wife, he related to her the confession of the dying criminal, and added, "Would to God I knew where he might be found." "I am happy," said his wife, "in being able to inform you." Arising as she said this, and taking from her drawer a package of letters received from Norman Francis, New York, "These letters are from our son, who with his wife are in that city." The effect of the disclosure of M.S. was so greatly afflicting to the mind of Mr. Ledyard that within 3 days from the time it was made, he died of an affection of the heart. As soon as possible after the funeral ceremonies were observed, Mrs. Ledyard started for New York. Her arrival, as the reader has learned, was just in time to save him from becoming a public charge. In a few days more they were all on their way to London, where Everard was received with great joy by those who knew him. The fact of his undeserved censure and sufferings added much to their sympathies and respect. With the large estate left him by his father, and an annuity of his wife's, Everard was enabled to open one of the largest stores in the city, where prosperity and happiness smiled upon him. The beginning of his life was dark, but its close was bright and honored.